Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. My name is Phoebe Potter. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the Council of State Governments Justice Center, and we'll be presenting today along with Leah Wawrzyniak, Senior Policy Analyst with the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices. Thanks to all of you for joining the webinar and to NGA for partnering with us on this presentation. Before getting started, I'd like to briefly talk through a couple of housecleaning items about how the webinar is going to work. Anytime during this webinar, you can ask your question by typing it into the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. This includes both technical and content-related questions. We will try to reply to technical questions in the chat window as we go, and for the content-related questions, we will keep a running list and adjust them all at the end of the webinar. We will do our best to get through as many questions as possible. If you encounter any technical or audio problems during the webinar, please call the WebEx Technical Support Line at the number that will be listed in the chat box. Please understand that there are some technical issues you may not be able to resolve. For this reason, we are going to record the content portion of this webinar and post it on our website at csgjusticecenter.org/NRC. We should have the webinar posted online early next week, and we'll email you a link when it's ready. We will also add a link to the PowerPoint slides in the chat box during the presentation. Lastly, although the webinar information indicates we will go until 3:30, our plan is to wrap up the webinar by 3 p.m. Before getting into the content of the presentation, I wanted to give you all a bit more background on the Council of State Governments Justice Center and National Governors Association. The Justice Center is a national nonprofit organization that serves policymakers at the local, state, and federal levels from all branches of government. Staff provide practical, nonpartisan advice and evidence-based, consensus-driven strategies to increase public safety and strengthen communities. Technical assistance for the Second Chance Act grant that you received related to this presentation is provided through the National Reentry Resource Center, which is funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and managed by us here at the Justice Center. We are constantly adding new content and resources to our website, and we send out a monthly newsletter that provides information about the latest research, funding opportunities, distance learning events like this one, and other news about reentry. To sign up for the newsletter, please visit the link on your screen after today's webinar. I'm going to turn it over to Leah with the National Governors Association Center for Practices to tell you a bit about their organization.
Thank you, Phoebe. Again, my name is Leah Wawrzyniak, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices. The National Governors Association is the collective voice of the nation's governors, and its members are the governors of the states, territories, and Commonwealth. I work in the Center for Best Practices, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. I'm in the Homeland Security and Public Safety Division, where we provide information, research, policy analysis, and technical assistance for governors and their staff about emerging policy trends across a range of issues related to Homeland Security and public safety. Included in that portfolio is overseeing a network of governors' criminal justice policy advisors. The CJPAs are senior staff in the governor's office or agencies with a primary focus on criminal justice and public safety issues. We are hosting the CJPA Institute on May 1st and 2nd, and we are featuring sessions on sentencing and corrections reform. If you have any questions about the CJPA network or the Institute, please contact my coworker, Jeff McLeod. His contact information is listed on the slide.
Great. Thanks, Leah. So, as you all know, this webinar was intended to serve two functions. One is to kind of prep for a lot of the folks on here who will be attending the State Recidivism Reduction Forum next week in Washington, D.C. on March 27th. And it's also an opportunity to kind of orient policymakers in your state to the SRR grant program. If you haven't been that involved in the work happening in your state, so you can kind of learn about the grant program and get some ideas for how to potentially leverage this grant opportunity to advance some of your policy goals in the state. And so this is the outline for our webinar. We're going to first give an overview of kind of the challenge of recidivism and from a state perspective, as well as opportunities for change. Then give an overview of the Second Chance Act Statewide Recidivism Reduction Grant Program, what it is, the timeline, how it functions. Then we're going to shift and talk about how that program can be leveraged to try to advance CJPA's recidivism reduction goals and the governor's goals in these states. And then lastly, talk a little bit about how you, as a policymaker, can get involved in the SRR planning process. So we'll start here with the challenge of recidivism from a state perspective. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this particular picture depicting kind of shifts in recidivism numbers from the rates between 1999 and 2002, and then changes then from 2004 to 2007. This was put together by the Pew Center in the States. And, you know, there's a lot of stories to be told by this data, but really the takeaway here is that overall, across the country, recidivism rates have continued to remain stubbornly high, about 45% on average when you look at kind of some of the state data coming out of the Bureau of Justice Statistics, but with great variation across states as well. You know, a number of states have made significant progress in reducing recidivism, but we know that it's quite difficult to accomplish. I'm going to turn it over to Leah to talk a little bit about, you know, that's the challenge that we face, but also kind of the opportunity to reduce those rates from the governor's perspective.
Thank you. So a number of states have enacted sentencing and corrections reforms that are data-driven, evidence-based, and maintain public safety while reducing costs. And recidivism reduction plays a large role in these reforms. As you can see, this slide features statements from a selection of governors on the importance of recidivism reduction. We also saw this focus at the NJA summer meeting that was held in Milwaukee last August. The meeting featured a session on advancing corrections reform and featured speakers Steve Oates from the Washington State Institute for Public Policy and A.T. Wall, the director of the Rhode Island Department of Corrections. Several governors were in attendance at the session, and they shared the reforms they've enacted in their states, including investing in programs that reduce recidivism. Of course, key to any recidivism reduction is good data and information sharing. NGA has headed up several projects with states to improve justice information sharing. We're currently working with several states focused on sharing corrections information to improve reentry outcomes. In helping advance recidivism reduction in the states are the governor's criminal justice policy advisors who play a key role. So you can see on this slide, when the governor makes recidivism reduction a priority, the CJPAs have many roles and responsibilities that they can play to advance these priorities. One is convening stakeholders across agencies that impact recidivism. This often includes agencies that are not strictly focused on public safety, including workforce development, education, and public health. Once stakeholders are convened, CJPAs work with them to develop a system-wide plan for recidivism reduction, fostering that information sharing and good data between the involved agencies. Along with facilitating information sharing, CJPAs work with the stakeholders to promote accountability to the plan and the ultimate goal that is set for reducing recidivism in the state. Once that plan and goal are developed, the CJPA can champion change across the system, aligning agency work and policies with the plan, which should align with the governor's priorities. And if evidence-based programs need to be implemented in the state as part of that plan, the CJPA can support funding for these programs, either through the governor's budget or working with their corrections agencies to reallocate resources as needed. Finally, it is key that after all this work is completed, the CJPA works with the stakeholders to monitor progress towards the goal and make adjustments as necessary.
Thanks, Leah. On this slide, I just wanted to highlight for folks on the phone that we worked with the Bureau of Justice Assistance and ASCA, the Association of State Correctional Administrators, to develop a series of recidivism reduction checklists. There's actually 3 checklists, one of which is targeted at legislative and executive policymakers, including CJPAs, and is intended to provide a very high-level kind of roadmap for the sorts of things that Leah was just talking about, making recidivism reduction a state priority and a key measure of successful corrections and reentry policy, developing a plan to actually implement evidence-based policies and practices, and then strategies to track progress and ensure there's accountability for results. So there's a link there to those checklists if you're interested in looking at those. So that's the challenge as well as the opportunity that we face. And again, you know, our hope was by bringing CJPs to this webinar that we can talk with you all about how the Statewide Recidivism Reduction Grant, or SRR grant program, can be used to help you meet those goals. So I'm going to give an overview now just of what the grant program is all about. The goal, at its simplest form, is to help states reduce kind of the historical baseline statewide recidivism rate. And the way that BJA wants states to try to accomplish that is through the things kind of listed here. So first, who we target with the grant. I think a lot of folks are familiar with Second Chance Act grants being fairly targeted, small, maybe serving 100 people in a demonstration program. This grant's a little bit different than that. It's intended to help build the overall state capacity and support state policy changes on a broader scale. And so the target population targeted here is a broader population that has disproportionately high recidivism rates. So obviously we're talking about kind of moderate and higher risk populations, but there might be other ways to look at your data and see if parolees happen to have higher recidivism rates than other folks in your population, things like that. So folks that have received these planning grants are asked to target a population based on data that indicates which people in your population are really leading to higher recidivism rates. So that's the target population. The policy focus areas listed here are the sorts of things that the grants are supposed to help support, ensuring that you use risk and needs assessment to drive case planning and resource allocation decisions, providing quality programming that targets the right types of needs to reduce recidivism, and effective supervision practices. So those are the three key policy areas. And the types of investments that are encouraged with the grant funding include system-wide policy reforms, the way resources are allocated, supervision intensity. So again, looking for things on a statewide scale to be changed. And then building capacity, sustainable changes that can really help your state corrections agencies effectively reduce recidivism, whether that's staff skill development, IT infrastructure, investing in new case management or assessment tools, or quality assurance processes. So these are some examples of the types of investments that BJA is looking for. The grant can also fund direct services, although that is the capacity building types things are more encouraged for this grant. Go to the next slide. This is how the grant program is structured. It's actually a two-phase process. You folks on the phone are one of representing the 13 states that received $100,000 grants in fiscal year 2013 to engage in what is called the planning and capacity building phase. And during this time, which really wraps up in this July 2014, so soon, and states have been working hard on developing these plans over the last few months, are expected to complete a planning process, which includes a planning and implementation guide that we here at the Justice Center are providing technical assistance around. That leads to writing an actual plan for how to reduce recidivism in your state that is data-driven. And so you must complete that plan in order to become eligible then for funding in phase 2, which is the implementation phase. And at that point, 2 to 4 of the 13 states that receive planning grants will then be selected by BJA to receive $3 million grants that would start in fiscal year 2014, so October 1st of this year. This is a very competitive process, clearly. Not all planning grants will be awarded implementation awards, and the grants are 3-year-long grants. Just in case folks aren't familiar, here's the list of the 13 states that received planning grants, primarily state corrections departments, but there are some other agencies in the mix as well. Eligibility for this grant is narrowed to state corrections agencies or state administering agencies. So this is a little bit of a deeper dive on that first phase that I was talking about, the planning process that the 13 current states are working on. As of February 14th, 2014, states were expected to have established a planning team and start to analyze recidivism data to establish a target population that meets the criteria BJA has laid out. At this point, states are now in the process of reviewing current policies and practices. And so this is the point in the planning work where a lot of assessments being done about gaps and needs in your state. And folks on these planning teams are trying to make some determinations about the best place to target the $3 million in implementation funding if it's to be received. And the deadline for completing recommendations for the implementation proposal We have June 27th listed here. That is the date for completing the planning and implementation grant I mentioned. The solicitations that will go to BDA requesting implementation funding will actually be due around July 15th. So again, a very condensed time frame, and I know that all the states have already been working hard on moving this process forward. So that's the overview, pretty high level of how the grant program is structured and what it's intended to fund. So with that, I want to shift into more discussion about how this grant program can be leveraged by criminal justice policy advisors or other state policymakers to try to advance recidivism reduction goals at the state level. This grant provides a really great opportunity to bring together broad stakeholders and develop a statewide strategic reentry plan. Many states may already have some reentry plans in place, but a lot of states are also, continually updating those plans, building on them. And so, again, this is a great opportunity to have a reason to bring stakeholders together to really take a look at your system and update your reentry plans for the state. It can also be used to build on existing plans, as I mentioned, or tie together related initiatives across the state. Oftentimes, there's a number of different criminal justice or reentry-related initiatives taking place in the state, and this grant, again, can be an opportunity to bring stakeholders together to take stock of all that work and think about how it's interrelated. It's also a very high-profile opportunity to bring attention to the governor's recidivism reduction goals. That early slide you showed with the governor's quotes, we see that a lot of attention to reentry and this issue of recidivism across the state. This is an actionable tool that can be used to really bring attention to the governor's goals and a way to really meet those goals. And as I mentioned, starting on October 1st of this year, a select number of states will receive $3 million in implementation funding. So clearly very direct support to help support your work in the state. So this slide kind of walks through some of the things that should be happening at the state level to advance recidivism reduction goals, regardless of this grant program, and then talk a little bit about how the grant can actually be tied to that. So first and foremost, as Leah and I both talked about, is that leadership commitment. The governor makes recidivism reduction a priority and kind of asks for a plan to meet those goals, and that's where we know CJPAs play a very big role in kind of turning those statements and goals into action. So again, the grant can really generate a lot of momentum around setting policy goals for the state if they don't exist, or expanding on them if they do. Once that leadership commitment is made, then you need to transition to developing a state plan. And again, this involves bringing together stakeholders who can take a data-driven, statewide approach to thinking about how to better align your state correction system with evidence-based practices. And the SRR grant and this planning process that your state's engaging in is a way that you can really lay out a comprehensive vision for how you're going to meet your policymakers' goals for reducing recidivism statewide. And then the third layer to this, of course, is resource support. And I broke this up because there's clearly the federal funding that would be potentially received to build capacity. But the grant also provides an opportunity to think about how to better realign or prioritize state resources in a sustainable way to drive change. So the SRR funding can build your state's capacity for implementing EBPs and better leverage the state resources that you have by ensuring that you're able to implement evidence-based practices effectively. This is the second year that the Recidivism Reduction Grant Program has been in existence, although it's the first time that we've done planning grants. But I did want to highlight a couple of the reforms that we've seen from this funding support for the original cohort of grantees that received $1 million implementation grants. So a little bit different structure, but funding the same type of things that I was discussing earlier. So there were 7 original grantees. I highlight 4 here. First is New York State, using this grant to try to actually build the capacity of their alternative sanctions for parolees who are at risk for violation. One of the big challenges that many states face is high recidivism rates that are driven by returns to prison for technical violations. And this is an issue that a lot of states are grappling with that New York chose to tackle with this grant. which supports kind of enhanced programming during a 45-day sanction for folks that are at high risk for violating their parole status, which in New York State is equivalent to a revocation, and providing follow-up community services. So using the grant to not just build programming, but actually be thoughtful about policies about when people are actually revoked to prison when they violate. Kansas is using their grant to fund a number of different components, including some enhanced cognitive behavioral programming, but they're really focusing on building their capacity around quality assurance and fidelity. So in addition to improving their programming and delivering it to a more broad audience, including individuals with mental illness, they are bringing on board fidelity coaches and developing a new tool to observe and coach program staff to ensure that there is program quality. So again, kind of thinking about that capacity building exercise, so that, you know, whether you're talking about a federally funded program or state funded programs, you're promoting quality and better alignment with evidence-based practices. Rhode Island is using the grant to really revamp their entire case management system. So, you know, we talk about affecting a broad target population in this grant. This is a great example of that. Really, every person in their system will be somehow affected by the proposals they're putting in place. They're revising policies and procedures, enhancing some of their programming, and doing a ton of staff training. It's a big bulk of their focus across their state corrections department to, again, ensure that their case management process is really aligned with evidence-based practices and driven by risk and needs assessment, and that those assessments are informing program placement decisions and community supervision practices. So another great example of using this grant funding to put in place sustainable capacity building that will ultimately make your sustainable state funding better utilized. And lastly, Louisiana, another state that's kind of targeting the issue of parole violators, actually focusing on parole and probation violators by enhancing their supervision strategies. So they're changing the way their caseloads are structured for their probation and parole officers, and also enhancing training for those officers to ensure they can work with high-risk parolees and probationers. And again, some investments in programming. But the bulk of the focus is trying to really demonstrate how to better structure resources with parole and probation officers through better case planning and caseloads to work with a high-risk population. So another example of leveraging a federal grant to accomplish state policy goals that really are going to live well beyond the length of the federal grant. So that wraps up kind of the examples of how this grant program can help criminal justice policy advisors advance recidivism reduction goals for the state, and how to use this grant to really bring a high level, bring a lot of attention and momentum around trying to meet policymakers' recidivism reduction goals. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit, given what the grant is and the sorts of things it can fund, some strategies for how you, as a policymaker who may not be as deeply involved in some of the planning work that's happening in your state, some strategies for getting involved. There's a couple of reasons to do this. One is ultimately to hopefully strengthen the plan that your state is working on, but it also will strengthen your competitiveness in terms of competing for the $3 million implementation funding. BJA, and this will be a theme discussed at the forum next week, is really looking to fund states that have demonstrated support by executive policymakers to the planning work. And that can articulate how the SRR planning process is really part of larger state policy goals that are being set by those policymakers. And they want to see a demonstrated commitment to statewide policy reform. Some of the examples I talked about in the other states, things that really shift the way the system functions, not just small pilot projects. And ultimately, putting those sorts of things in place requires having your executive policymakers at the table to sign off on some of those changes. So how can you get involved? For starters, just connecting with your SRR planning team in your state. And if you're not sure who those folks are, please follow up with me and we can kind of connect you with the right people. Also connect the SRR work to other state initiatives. Oftentimes, as I talked about earlier, states are taking on a number of different projects, whether it's justice reinvestment, PPC or just an internal initiative in your state to try to advance reentry, be thoughtful about how you can tie the SRR grant program to those initiatives and ultimately bolster them. Third, as I think most of the folks that are attending this webinar are doing, attend the forum next week in Washington, D.C., or have representatives from your state come to that forum. We're really excited to have an opportunity to meet with you in person, along with our partners from NDA and ASCA and BJA, of course, to talk about a lot of the similar things that we're talking about here, but in more depth. And then lastly, think about ways to use your grant to really champion statewide policy reforms and elevate kind of the attention to the issue of reentry and recidivism reduction in your state. So just a couple strategies. And with that, that really concludes kind of the content portion of this webinar. Again, just a brief orientation for folks to get more familiar with the grant. So at this point, we can open it up to questions and answers. We unfortunately cannot do verbal Q&A, but you can type any questions you might have in the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and we will answer them as they come in. Thank you.